Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. This time we're going deep, really deep, into the world of work, but with a unique perspective.
A twist, you could say.
Yeah, twist. We're focusing on the experiences and rights of Indigenous peoples. It's a group that's, well, often overlooked when we talk about jobs in the economy, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And what makes this deep dive so special is that we're using information gathered directly from Indigenous communities. No secondhand accounts here.
Straight from the source.
Yeah.
And how do they get this information? I'm intrigued.
They use a tool called the Indigenous Navigator. It allows communities to track and share information about their own economic and social well-being, everything from employment numbers to access to things like education and healthcare.
Wow, that's pretty comprehensive. And they even capture the impact of climate change on their lives.
They do. It's a really impressive initiative. It really empowers these communities.
It's a far cry from relying on, those typical dry government reports that often miss the nuances of real life.
Exactly. We're getting the real story here.
So, no dusty old statistics. What are some of the key things we'll be uncovering in this deep dive? What really stood out?
Well, we'll be looking at some tough realities, like the barriers Indigenous peoples face in getting a good education, quality education.
Right, and how that impacts their opportunities in a job market that's constantly evolving.
Yeah, it's a rapidly changing landscape, and traditional jobs are being affected by things like globalization and climate change.
That's a fascinating aspect. Think about it. Traditional occupations, things that have sustained these communities for centuries, are now facing pressures they've never encountered before.
Right, and we'll examine how these communities are adjusting, whether it's by revitalizing traditional crafts or, maybe embracing new technologies. They're carving out a space for themselves in this new digital world.
It's a story of, well, I'd say resilience, definitely innovation, and a fight for economic justice. And speaking of justice, we'll also be taking a close look at how the pandemic, COVID-19, impacted their livelihoods.
It definitely exposed existing inequalities and amplified them. It hit Indigenous communities particularly hard.
It makes you think about how we build a more inclusive future of work for everyone, a future where everyone has a fair chance.
Absolutely, a future that benefits everyone. And that's exactly what we'll be exploring.
I'm ready to dive in. One of the most striking things from the Indigenous Navigator data was the gap in education levels between Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations.
It's a persistent problem, and the numbers are concerning. In some communities, over 80% of Indigenous children finish primary school, which sounds good on the surface, but then in others, it's less than half.
Wow, that's a huge difference. And what about higher education? Vocational training?
Those numbers drop drastically.
So even when there is progress, it's not evenly spread. What are some of the reasons for this educational gap?
Poverty is a huge factor. Many families can't afford basic school supplies, or they have to pull their kids out of school to help with work. And then there's distance. In many remote communities, schools are just too far, especially for older kids.
It's like a logistical nightmare.
Yeah, exactly. And even when kids can get to school, the quality of education in those remote areas can be a problem.
Right. The resources might be limited, and the teachers might not have the training to meet their specific needs, like cultural and linguistic needs.
You hit the nail on the head. Those factors play a significant role.
It's a complex issue, and then we layer on top of that the digital divide. The data showed that less than half of the communities they surveyed have internet at home.
And with the pandemic, the digital divide became an even bigger barrier because so much learning and work shifted online. Just imagine trying to keep up with your studies without reliable internet.
It's nearly impossible to compete in today's world without that basic access. So what we're seeing is this lack of access to good education has a ripple effect.
Exactly. It limits their chances of getting well-paying jobs in the formal economy.
And so many are pushed into informal work, which often lacks stability, decent pay, and basic worker protections.
It's a vicious cycle that can be incredibly difficult to break.
Absolutely. Yeah. But before we go further into the modern job market, let's step back and explore traditional occupations. It's incredible that most Indigenous peoples around the world still rely on these for their livelihood.
It speaks to the strength of their traditions and cultures, their adaptability.
We're talking about more than just farming and fishing, right?
Right.
Although those are essential.
Right. It's also about things like intricate weaving, traditional healing that's been passed down for generations, even sustainable forestry and resource management. It's remarkable.
The Indigenous Navigator had some really vivid descriptions, and I was captivated by the stories of Indigenous women creating beautiful textiles and crafts, using materials from nature and keeping those traditions alive.
Their skills and knowledge are truly impressive. But these traditional occupations, they're facing increasing pressure in our rapidly changing world.
The data didn't sugarcoat the challenges, did it?
It didn't. We saw firsthand accounts from indigenous communities, for example, in Asia, talking about how deforestation was making it impossible to continue their traditional forest-based livelihoods.
Their way of life is literally under threat.
And then there's climate change, which adds another layer of complexity.
From changes in weather patterns disrupting agriculture to rising sea levels threatening coastal communities, it's a lot to contend with.
It is, and it highlights a crucial point. Indigenous people are experiencing the effects of climate change firsthand, yet they're often left out of the conversations about solutions.
It's a missed opportunity, considering their history as stewards of the environment.
Definitely. Their traditional knowledge and practices offer valuable insights into addressing climate change and creating a more sustainable future for all of us. It's a wellspring of knowledge that we should be tapping into.
Absolutely. And despite these economic and environmental pressures, it's inspiring to see such a strong spirit of entrepreneurship emerging within Indigenous communities.
The Indigenous Navigator showcases this beautifully, highlighting Indigenous-led businesses in so many sectors, like agriculture, handicrafts, even ecotourism and renewable energy. It's a remarkable display of resilience and innovation.
It's like they're finding ways to not just survive, but to thrive in the face of adversity.
They are. And a really powerful example is the story of Sabengi. Have you heard of them?
Tell me more.
Sabengi is a group of indigenous women in Asia who came together and started selling their handcrafted products online, especially during the pandemic. It's a great example of using technology to create opportunities and reach new markets.
It's incredibly inspiring.
Yeah.
But even with this drive and ingenuity, I imagine Indigenous entrepreneurs still face significant hurdles.
They do. One of the biggest challenges is access to capital. Traditional lenders are often reluctant to give loans to indigenous businesses, seeing them as high risk.
And I imagine there's a lack of access to networks and markets that could help them grow their businesses.
Absolutely, and this is where support and targeted policies are crucial. It's about creating a level playing field where indigenous entrepreneurs have a genuine chance to succeed.
So true. We need to make sure everyone has a fair shot at economic empowerment. Now, another recurring theme in the data was land rights. It seems like a fundamental issue.
It is. For indigenous peoples, land is much more than just an economic asset. It's profoundly connected to their cultural identity, their spirituality, their traditional practices. Having secure land rights is absolutely essential for their well-being and self-determination.
And yet, the data shows that legal recognition of Indigenous land rights is still a major challenge in many parts of the world.
You're right. A key international agreement, the ILO Convention 169, which protects these rights, hasn't been widely adopted, particularly in Asia and Africa. Without that legal foundation, communities are vulnerable to things like land grabbing, exploitation, and even displacement. It's a very real threat.
It's disheartening. And the data showed that even in places where land rights are recognized, there are still conflicts and challenges.
We saw reports of illegal logging, mining operations encroaching on indigenous territories, and even disagreements within communities, sometimes driven by external pressures.
And then there are the large-scale infrastructure projects like dams and pipelines, which can be devastating for traditional land use and cultural sites.
It's a complex issue, and the solutions need a multifaceted approach. We need stronger legal frameworks, effective enforcement, and meaningful dialogue between governments, businesses, and indigenous communities.
It's about finding a balance, a way to move forward that respects everyone's rights and interests.
Absolutely. And it's crucial to consider the specific challenges indigenous women face regarding land rights.
That's a good point. In many Indigenous cultures, women don't have the same legal rights to own land or inherit it as men do. It limits their economic power and influence in decision-making.
It has huge implications, not just for their livelihoods, but for the well-being of their families and communities as a whole. Empowering indigenous women is essential for true equality and sustainable development.
I completely agree. Another critical aspect highlighted in the data is the lack of social protection for many Indigenous communities.
Social protection, the safety net that's supposed to be there for the most vulnerable is often missing for indigenous peoples. The data showed that less than half the population in most communities is covered by any kind of social protection program.
That's a shocking statistic.
They often slip through the cracks of mainstream welfare systems, which leaves them more exposed to poverty, illness, and economic shocks.
And the pandemic really brought this to light, didn't it?
It did. The pandemic made existing inequalities worse, and these communities, already struggling with healthcare, education, and economic opportunity, were hit even harder.
It's like they were left to fend for themselves without a safety net.
And this is where we need to see significant change. Policies need to shift, and more investment is needed to create social protection systems that are truly inclusive and accessible for Indigenous populations. We need to guarantee access to healthcare, provide income support when jobs are lost, and create programs that specifically address the needs of children and elders.
It's about acknowledging that everyone, regardless of their background or where they live, deserves basic social and economic security. It's a fundamental human right.
Exactly. And speaking of rights, we can't ignore the difficult reality of violations of basic rights at work.
The data was pretty sobering in this area. It's clear that Indigenous peoples are disproportionately affected by discrimination, exploitation, even forced labor. It's a harsh reminder that the fight for social justice is far from over.
And it's heartbreaking to see reports of child labor within Indigenous communities. The data links this issue to poverty and the lack of other economic opportunities.
It's tragic. These children are forced to work to help their families survive, and it just perpetuates the cycle of poverty. It's a vicious cycle that needs to be broken.
Absolutely. And to break it, we need a multi-pronged approach. We need to address the root causes of poverty, like lack of education and discrimination. And we also need to hold businesses accountable, making sure they're upholding basic human rights and ensuring fair labor practices throughout their supply chains.
It's about creating a world where every child has a real opportunity to not just survive, but to thrive.
That's the goal, a world where everyone can live and work with dignity and respect. That's what we should all be striving for.
So we've talked about some serious challenges, and it's easy to feel overwhelmed. But the Indigenous Navigator doesn't just present problems. It also offers solutions, pathways forward.
It's a call to action, urging us to move beyond just acknowledging these issues and actually start working towards solutions.
And one key area highlighted is supporting Indigenous entrepreneurship.
Exactly. Providing access to capital, to markets, to training can empower these entrepreneurs to create jobs, revitalize their traditions, and contribute to sustainable economic growth.
We've already seen some incredible examples of Indigenous-led businesses making a real difference in their communities.
And these businesses often prioritize environmental sustainability, using traditional knowledge to create products and services that are beneficial for both people and the planet.
So it's not just about social justice, it's about investing in the future of our planet.
Exactly. The Indigenous Navigator gives us a powerful roadmap for a more sustainable and equitable future.
It's a vision worth fighting for. And in addition to supporting entrepreneurship, it's crucial to ensure equal access to quality education and vocational training for Indigenous peoples.
I couldn't agree more. And that education needs to be culturally relevant. It should incorporate Indigenous knowledge systems and languages, and it should prepare students for a wide range of careers, not just a limited few.
The data highlighted a fantastic example of an Indigenous youth organization in Asia that's supporting students pursuing higher education. They even advocated for a quota for Indigenous lawyers in their National Bar Association.
That's incredible. It's a testament to the power of community-led initiatives and the importance of creating pathways for Indigenous peoples to enter professions that have historically excluded them.
It's inspiring, but we also need action at the policy level. Governments need to create legal frameworks and invest in programs that protect the rights and well-being of Indigenous peoples.
Absolutely. This includes ensuring fair labor practices, providing access to social safety nets, and as we talked about earlier, recognizing and protecting land rights. These are essential steps.
And it's not just about government action. We need to see greater collaboration between Indigenous communities, the private sector, and civil society organizations.
Working together is essential. We can create solutions that are sustainable, equitable, and just. Solutions that work for everyone.
And at the heart of all this is the need to listen to Indigenous voices, to respect their knowledge, their cultures, and their aspirations.
It's about recognizing them not just as stakeholders, but as rights holders, because their rights are fundamentally connected to our collective well-being.
It's about understanding that their well-being is intertwined with our own. Their future is our future.
Perfectly said. And as we've been exploring these complex issues, one thing that keeps coming back to me is the sheer resilience of Indigenous peoples. It's awe-inspiring.
I agree. They've faced so many challenges, both historical and ongoing, and yet they continue to adapt, to innovate, to thrive. It's remarkable.
They're not just passive victims, they're active agents of change. They draw on their traditions and their cultural values to build a better future for themselves and their communities.
That story we discussed about the indigenous women in Asia who started their online marketplace during the pandemic, that's a perfect example of their entrepreneurial spirit and their ability to turn a crisis into an opportunity.
Absolutely. It's a testament to their strength and ingenuity. And it reflects a broader trend we see in the data from the Indigenous Navigator. More and more Indigenous peoples are organizing, reclaiming their rights, revitalizing their cultures, and building a more sustainable future.
It's inspiring. It gives us hope. It shows that change is possible, even when facing seemingly insurmountable obstacles.
It does, and it reminds us that we can't just stand by and admire their resilience. We have a responsibility to support their efforts and amplify their voices. We need to be allies in their fight for justice and equality.
So what does this all mean for us, the listeners? How can we make a difference?
Well, the first step is education. The Indigenous Navigator website is a great resource. You can learn more about the challenges Indigenous peoples are facing around the world, and you can discover the solutions being developed.
Knowledge is power. Once we understand the issues, we can start taking action. We can support Indigenous-led organizations and businesses, many of which are doing incredible work in areas like sustainable development, cultural preservation, and human rights advocacy. We can use our wallets to vote for a better future.
Exactly. And we can use our voices, too. We can hold our governments and corporations accountable for upholding Indigenous rights and ensuring that development projects respect their land, their culture, and their livelihoods.
We can advocate for policies that promote inclusivity, equity, and justice for all.
And ultimately, it's about recognizing that Indigenous peoples are not just stakeholders, they're rights holders. And their rights are absolutely crucial to our collective well-being. The Indigenous Navigator makes this clear. Respecting Indigenous rights isn't just about social justice. It's essential for a sustainable future for all of us.
It's a powerful message. So, what can you do to support Indigenous communities and businesses? Start by learning more. Share what you learn. Spread the word.
Small actions can create big change. Let's all do our part.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you learned something new and feel inspired to take action.
Stay curious and stay engaged. We'll see you next time.
Yeah, it really is a threat to their way of life. It's such a complex problem with so many interconnected factors.
Definitely interconnected, and it really underscores a critical point. Indigenous peoples are experiencing the effects of climate change firsthand, yet they're often left out of the discussions when it comes to solutions.
Which seems like a huge missed opportunity given their long history as caretakers of the environment.
Absolutely. Their traditional knowledge and practices could be so valuable in tackling climate change and building a more sustainable future for everyone.
We could learn so much from them. But it's amazing to see that even amidst these economic and environmental pressures, there's a strong spirit of entrepreneurship within Indigenous communities.
Oh, absolutely. The Indigenous Navigator showcased that so well, highlighting all these Indigenous-led businesses and sectors. You wouldn't even think of agriculture, handicrafts, ecotourism, renewable energy. It's
Think
incredible.
about turning challenges into opportunities.
Exactly. They're not just adapting, they're finding ways to thrive. And a great example of this is the story of Sabang.
Sabangi, tell me more.
It's a collective of Indigenous women in Asia who came together to sell their handcrafted products online. They really ramped this up during the COVID-19 pandemic. It's a perfect example of how they're leveraging technology to create economic opportunities and reach new markets.
It's so inspiring to see them taking control and building their own success. But I'm sure even with that entrepreneurial spirit, they still face systemic barriers.
Definitely. One of the biggest is access to capital bill. Traditional lenders are often hesitant to provide loans to Indigenous businesses. They often see them as too risky.
And I bet there's also limited access to networks and markets that could help them scale their businesses.
Absolutely. And that's where targeted support and policy changes come in. It's about leveling the playing field. So Indigenous entrepreneurs have a real shot at success.
We need to ensure everyone has an equal opportunity to achieve economic empowerment. Now, another topic that came up repeatedly in the Indigenous Navigator data was land rights.
It's a fundamental issue. For Indigenous peoples, land isn't just an economic asset. It's deeply intertwined with their cultural identity, spirituality, and traditional practices. Secure land tenure is absolutely crucial to their well-being and self-determination.
But the data revealed that legal recognition of Indigenous land rights is still a significant challenge in many parts of the world.
You're right. The ILO Convention 169, which is a key international agreement that protects these rights, it hasn't been widely ratified, particularly in regions like Asia and Africa. Without that legal foundation, communities are vulnerable to land-grabbing exploitation displacement.
It's a constant threat hanging over their heads.
Hmm.
And even in places where land rights are legally recognized, the data highlighted that there are often conflicts and challenges in practice.
Definitely. We saw reports of illegal logging mining operations encroaching on indigenous territories, and there are even disputes within or between communities, sometimes fueled by those external pressures. It's a complicated situation.
Not to mention the impact of large-scale infrastructure projects like dams and pipelines, which can have devastating consequences for traditional land use and cultural sites.
It's a complex landscape, and finding solutions requires a multifaceted approach. We need to strengthen legal frameworks, ensure effective enforcement, and foster dialogue between governments, businesses, and indigenous communities. It's about finding common ground and working together.
And within this complex landscape, we also need to be mindful of the specific challenges faced by Indigenous women when it comes to land rights.
Absolutely. In many indigenous cultures, women don't have the same legal rights to land ownership or inheritance as men. It undermines their economic power and limits their influence in community decision-making.
And that has broader implications not just for their own livelihoods, but for the well-being of their families and communities as a whole. Empowering Indigenous women is essential for achieving true equality and sustainable development.
I completely agree. Now, another important area highlighted in the Indigenous Navigator data is the issue of social protection. The safety net that societies provide for their most vulnerable members.
And the data was pretty alarming in this regard. It seems like in most Indigenous communities, less than half the population is covered by any kind of social protection program.
That's right. They often fall through the cracks of mainstream welfare systems.
Yeah.
This leaves them disproportionately exposed to poverty, illness, and economic shocks.
The COVID-19 pandemic really exposed that vulnerability, didn't it?
Absolutely. The pandemic amplified those existing inequalities. It hit communities that were already struggling with access to healthcare, education, and economic opportunities the hardest.
And without adequate social safety nets, many were left with no support to navigate those difficult times.
We need a major shift in policy and investment to create social protection systems that are truly inclusive and accessible to Indigenous populations. This means ensuring access to healthcare, providing income support for those who lose their jobs, and creating programs that specifically address the needs of children and elders.
We need to acknowledge that everyone deserves basic social and economic security. Shouldn't matter where you come from or what your background is.
Exactly. And we can't talk about social and economic security without addressing the issue of violations of fundamental rights at work.
This was a sobering aspect of the data. Indigenous peoples are disproportionately affected by discrimination, exploitation, even forced labor. It's a harsh reminder that the fight for social justice is far from over.
It's a sad reality. The reports of child labor within Indigenous communities were particularly disturbing.
It's heartbreaking to think about children being forced to work. It robs them of their childhood and their future.
And the data shows that it's often linked to poverty and a lack of other economic opportunities. Children have to work to help their families survive. It perpetuates a cycle of poverty that's so difficult to break.
We need to find ways to break that cycle for the sake of those children and their communities.
It's essential. And to do that, we need a multi-pronged approach. We need to address those root causes like poverty, lack of access to education, and discrimination. But we also need to hold businesses accountable. We need to ensure they're upholding basic human rights and ensuring fair labor practices throughout their supply chains.
It's about creating a world where every child has the chance not just to survive, but to truly thrive.
That's the goal. A world where everyone can live and work with dignity and respect.
It's a vision worth striving for. So we've discussed some pretty heavy challenges. It's easy to feel overwhelmed. But the Indigenous Navigator doesn't just present problems. It also offers solutions, pathways forward.
It's a call to action. It's about moving beyond simply acknowledging the issues and actually working towards solutions.
And one of the key areas highlighted is the need to support Indigenous entrepreneurship.
Providing access to capital market opportunities and business training, these are key to empowering Indigenous entrepreneurs to create jobs, revitalize their traditions, and contribute to sustainable economic growth.
We've already seen some fantastic examples of Indigenous-led businesses making a real difference.
And what's interesting is that many of these businesses have a strong focus on environmental sustainability. They're using traditional knowledge and practices to create products and services that are good for both people and the planet.
It's a win-win situation.
Mm-hmm.
Investing in Indigenous communities isn't just a matter of social justice. It's an investment in the future of our planet.
Exactly. The Indigenous Navigator data shows us that supporting Indigenous communities is crucial for a more sustainable and equitable future for everyone.
It's a roadmap for a better world. And along with supporting entrepreneurship, it's equally important to ensure that Indigenous peoples have equal access to quality education and vocational training.
Absolutely. And that education needs to be culturally relevant. It should incorporate Indigenous knowledge systems and languages and prepare students for a variety of careers.
The data mentioned a really interesting example, an Indigenous youth organization in Asia that's providing support for students pursuing higher education. They even advocated for a quota for Indigenous lawyers in their National Bar Association.
That's fantastic. It shows what can be achieved through community-led initiatives and highlights the importance of creating pathways for Indigenous peoples to enter professions that have historically been closed off to them.
These efforts are truly inspiring. But we also need to see action at the policy level. Governments have a responsibility to create legal frameworks and invest in programs that protect the rights and well-being of Indigenous peoples.
Absolutely. That includes ensuring fair labor practices, providing access to social safety nets, and of course, recognizing and protecting land rights. These are fundamental steps.
And it can't just be about government action either. We need to see greater collaboration and partnership between Indigenous communities, the private sector, and civil society organizations.
We need to work together to create solutions that are sustainable, equitable, and just solutions that benefit everyone.
And at the core of all of this is the need to listen to Indigenous voices.
Yeah.
We need to respect their knowledge, their cultures, and their aspirations.
It's about recognizing them not just as stakeholders, but as rights holders. Their rights are essential to our collective well-being.
Their future is intertwined with ours.
Yeah.
As we've gone through all these complex issues, I've been struck by the resilience of Indigenous peoples.
It's really quite remarkable.
They've faced so much hardship both historically and today, yet they continue to find ways to adapt and innovate and thrive.
They're not giving up. They're taking charge, drawing on their traditional knowledge and cultural values to create a better future for themselves and their communities.
Like that story we talked about, the Indigenous women in Asia who launched that online marketplace during the pandemic. It's a perfect example of their spirit and how they can turn challenges into opportunities.
Absolutely. And it highlights a broader trend that's evident in the Indigenous Navigator data. There's a growing movement of Indigenous peoples organizing themselves to reclaim their rights, revitalize their cultures, and build a more sustainable future.
That's truly inspiring. It shows us that change is possible even in the face of what seem like impossible odds.
It does. But we can't just sit back and admire their resilience. We have a responsibility to support their efforts to amplify their voices. We need to be allies in their fight for justice and equality.
So what does this all mean for us, the listeners?
Mm-hmm.
What can we do to make a difference?
Well, one of the most important things is education. The Indigenous Navigator website is a fantastic resource. It's a great place to learn more about the issues facing Indigenous peoples around the world and the solutions being developed.
Knowledge is power. Once we understand the issues, we can start taking action. We can support Indigenous-led organizations and businesses. Many of them are doing incredible work in areas like sustainable development, cultural preservation, and human rights advocacy.
Exactly. And we can also use our voices to hold our governments and corporations accountable. We need to make sure they're upholding Indigenous rights and that development projects are carried out in a way that respects their land culture and livelihoods.
We can all be advocates for policies that promote inclusivity, equity, and justice for everyone.
Absolutely. And at the end of the day, it's about recognizing that Indigenous peoples are not just stakeholders, but rights holders. Their rights are fundamentally connected to our own well-being. As the Indigenous Navigator data clearly shows, respecting those rights is not just a matter of social justice, it's essential for a sustainable future for all of us.
It's a message we can't ignore. So what can you do to support Indigenous communities and businesses? Start by learning more. Share what you learn. Spread the word.
Small actions can have a big impact. We can all make a difference.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the world of Indigenous peoples and the future of work.
It's been a pleasure sharing this information with you.
We hope you'll continue to explore this important topic and find ways to get involved.
Until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep advocating for a more just and sustainable world for everyone.
We'll see you on the next deep dive.